It all started when I noticed it one morning after I woke up. It was so bizarre. There was never any sign of it there before, but a lump had mysteriously appeared on my abdomen, about the size of a lemon. I went to see my doctor a few days later, and I knew exactly what he was thinking, although he didn't say it out loud. Even though I had a feeling it could be cancer, I found it so odd that this didn't upset me. And I noticed right away that I was feeling an unusual sense of excitement about it, which was really strange to me. For some reason, I had this amazing feeling that my life was about to pivot into a new and transformative direction. I can't explain it, but it was as though I had woken up in an altered state that morning. It felt like I was on a natural high. It was like an invisible force of love throughout my whole being. I just remember wanting that feeling to last forever. It was in that moment of seeing it that I made a clear decision for myself. If this lump was actually cancer, I was not going to label myself a victim. This was not going to be a war against cancer, because I know that fighting against something only gives power to whatever you're battling. So it wasn't my intention to beat cancer. It just felt logical and surprisingly really easy at the time to just embrace the situation rather than submit myself to fear and defensiveness. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, my sister Colette got hurt in a school sport, and the x-ray for her injury unexpectedly revealed a tumor, which turned out to be bone cancer. From that moment on, the ordinary ease and normalcy of my childhood quickly slipped away as we all embarked on a roller coaster ride with cancer leading the way. Colette faced it with incredible strength and acceptance. Not only was our whole family behind her, but our whole community supported her as well. So many people were touched by her beautiful personality, and hundreds of people rallied around her as she bravely took on this unexpected intruder for about 6 years. She passed away the night before her 20th birthday. As I walked out of my doctor's office that morning and stood by the elevator, I remember a feeling that Colette was right there with me. And I wondered if maybe it was because of her somehow that I was feeling so calm about this whole situation. Out of us 5 kids, Colette was the middle child, and after she was gone, there was an ominous void that followed me around for a long time. It just amplified an overwhelming fear of losing another family member. As a result, I spent most of my life in a very protective state, a habit of mindless worry. That was basically the unspoken vow I committed to after Colette passed away. This vow to worry. We'd grown even closer and even more protective as a family, so worrying about each other just became a habit that seemed so easy to slip into. As they say, life first tosses a stone, then a boulder, and then we hit a brick wall when we continue to ignore that whisper from our inner guidance that leads us to our best life. And I now see how a lifetime of worrying had become such familiar territory for me, and it was just leading me further away from accessing that inner joy that I so deeply desired all of those years. So discovering the lump was me hitting that proverbial brick wall. I wondered maybe if part of me was asking for something dramatic to shake me out of my self-destructive patterns of chronic worry, because it's no fun to worry about everything. It takes a lot of effort and heaviness. It sets the stage for a very low vibration of negative thoughts and energy. After experiencing such a profound loss in my childhood, I allowed myself to become consumed with worry. Deep down, I knew that hitting this brick wall was just what I needed to wake up and reset things for myself. That unexpected, comforting energy that emerged that morning was the carefree feeling I'd been yearning for ever since my sister died. And all those years of my childhood, I'd been spending most of my time creating an environment for more things to show up for me to worry about. The loop of toxic thoughts and negative self-talk that went on for countless hours in my head was not very pleasant. So I'm convinced that this lump situation was just the result of my habitual unhealthy focus. This was a turning point for me. It was clear that it was my choice to either add this possibility of cancer to my worry list or allow it to radically change my whole perspective, my whole way of thinking. My whole world felt so different after Colette died, and over the years, all that anxiety had stifled my trust in life and lowered my self-esteem, which eventually imposed a sense of hidden shame within me. A trap I often fell into was to continually devalue myself, even as an adult, especially when I didn't meet the standards I saw others attaining, like other women, other friends, other moms. This loop of negativity that pulsed through my head was a constant reminder that I was just not measuring up to everyone else. I internally beat myself down and I chased after an unrealistic version of myself. I was constantly comparing myself to others and ultimately sabotaged my own self-worth by expecting to achieve and maintain an uncomfortable level of perfectionism, trying to perfect aspects of my life that just didn't seem to fit into the mold that others were able to attain. I was driving myself crazy trying to keep up with this faulty version of myself. The more I yearned for this false perfection, the more I not only hurt myself, but I'm certain hurt others as well. If only back then I had heard the inspiring words of Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote one of my favorite books, Eat, Pray, Love. She shared her opinion of perfectionism in an interview with Marie Forleo. She said, "Perfectionism is the murderer of all good things. Perfectionism is a serial killer that goes around killing joy, spontaneity, wonder, grace, and humility." Perfectionism is a particularly dangerous kind of fear. It's fear in high-heeled shoes because it's fancy. It's a really fancy haute couture version of fear, which can advertise itself as a virtue and can trick you into letting you think it makes you special. People say, "I have such high standards," or use it as a fault that I just care too much. Hearing this put all of it into perspective, and I had to ask myself what I was afraid of that caused me to feel the need to be someone other than my true self. My body created whatever was growing inside of me, so part of me knew that my body could also let it go given the right conditions. I trusted the wisdom of my body. This was an opportunity for me to actually notice how my body really got my attention, since I missed all those cues from life when it was showing me that I was spending way too much time in unhappiness. I was aware that this lump was a powerful gift. More than anything, it was a messenger. Respecting its presence would allow it to bring me its lessons, and then I was hoping it would just leave when it was no longer needed. I knew that if I battled against it, it would give power to its aspects that could have been misconstrued as an attack on my body. Since I had become a compulsive worrier, desperate for validation and hopelessly searching for a sense of relief from the anxiety, I had created a very disingenuous expression of myself. But perfecting this false personality was successfully cutting myself off from being the real me. This addiction to comparison and the yearning for perfectionism convinced me that I needed to be just as good as those who were a threat to my ego, or in other words, a threat to my false self. And the need to maintain this false reality is what kept me from living an authentic life. Trying to measure up to others was eating me up inside and became an ideal breeding ground for instability and self-deprecation. All those toxic thoughts about myself created the right conditions for this mysterious lump to manifest itself in my body. I continued to wake up feeling that subtle thrill inside, even though I was facing a life-altering imposition on my health. I didn't understand this excitement and this sense of total well-being, considering the circumstances and the possibility of a dire prognosis. But it seemed to come from a higher source. It continued to show up, and I just didn't want it to end. I was so grateful for that comfort I felt and was so relieved there was no fear. I couldn't believe I wasn't worrying. Learning to let go of perfectionism and comparison has been a huge challenge, but letting it go continually brings me massive emotional relief. I now strive for excellence rather than perfectionism, and I highly value living with integrity. And now I live with a more mindful focus, just doing my own personal best at finding whatever feels like honest comfort within me. The need to control outside circumstances in order to avoid feeling inferior to others, or in general, fearing life, thankfully has dissipated for me over the years. At first, the only person who knew was my husband, and in order to not scare our 3 young kids at the time, we never formally sat them down to explain what was happening. Instead, we spoke openly about it in front of them, and if they picked up on any of it, they were never exposed to any unnecessary fear. They were completely unaffected by our conversations, because there was never a reason for them to feel threatened or stressed by something they may have overheard. I waited a few days after discovering the lump to share the news with my parents and my siblings. Although I couldn't predict my future, there was something reassuring me in the back of my mind that this was going to be a short-term situation without the need for chemo or radiation. I was just so surprised that I felt zero fear and that I was 100% completely at peace about it all. That was just not how I typically handled my life. So I continued to just trust my intuition. For decades after Colette passed away, I believed all of my negative thoughts. My thoughts had me believe I should fear life, that this world we live in is not safe. I believed that I was flawed and undeserving and unworthy of experiencing true happiness. My foreboding thoughts had me convinced that I needed to tread carefully in order to avoid being hurt. I was constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop, stopping myself from fully embracing all the blessings that surrounded me. I believed all those fearful thoughts, especially the fear of losing someone I loved. The examinations for the lump started within 24 hours of my first doctor's visit, and I was fast-tracked through a battery of tests and was sent from one specialist to the other. And every single healthcare professional that I was lined up with seemed to reciprocate my expectation for my body to be healed. I was comforted with total support from the medical community. The tricky part was that I had asked my family to keep my situation confidential, because I had assumed that if word spread through my extended family and our friends, they might choose to support me with their sympathy and concern and potentially influence me back into fear. My vibration was kept so high and so light with the privacy surrounding my situation, and I didn't feel like a victim. I didn't think many people would understand that, because the threat of cancer is typically seen as a stressful situation for most people. And this natural high that I was on was not something I could explain to everyone at that time. It was confirmed that I had a complex tumor attached to my left ovary. And the only option presented to me at the time was to operate in order to investigate the condition of the tumor. If it was non-malignant, they would remove only the tumor. And if it was cancerous, they would do a total hysterectomy, unfortunately removing both ovaries and all. After spending decades worrying about everything, I was still shocked that the plans for surgery didn't toss me back into a tornado of worrying. Looking back, all those years of chronic worrying had masked my view of life. It was like a veil over my eyes, distorting the blessings that surrounded me. I never allowed myself to blissfully feel happy because I feared that if I deeply loved something or someone, then the loss would be that much deeper. So I clutched onto fear as my protection. But my fear of someone else dying kept me focused on losing them rather than on being fully present when I was with them. And engaging in life's pure pleasures was something I often denied myself. This whole thing was moving along so easily until one afternoon when I found something in my mailbox. It was an unexpected letter from the cancer hospital. What threw me off was they included a red patient ID card inside with the letter. My first reaction was to immediately throw it out. And then my second reaction was to cry for the very first time since I had noticed the lump. It was in that moment that reality sunk in and I completely slipped into absolute fear. All I could think about was, how dare they send me a membership card to the cancer club without even knowing for sure if I had cancer? After a few minutes, I somehow stepped out of that fear and ended up digging the card out from the garbage. I decided to play their game, but I would be making my own rules. So that day came, and all of us with our little red membership cards gathered in the auditorium. I noticed how oddly disconnected I felt from everyone around me. There was a friendly volunteer who was leading the orientation, and she started things off with a really sad story about losing a loved one to cancer. That was all I needed to hear to know that the next few hours could potentially drop kick me from that natural high into a cesspool of fear. So feeling a bit rebellious, I slipped on my earbuds and turned up my music just loud enough to drown out everything I was supposed to be listening to. I took out a notebook and began to write. I wrote one line over and over again until the talk was finished. I wrote, "My true self is leading me to my best life." Then while my group paraded through the maze of treatment areas, I pretended to myself that I was just a tourist rather than a potential patient. I had set the intention to attend the day's orientation to simply follow protocol and stayed committed to keeping this natural high alive. I did not want to be snapped out of it. As I walked back to the hospital after lunch, I remember how warm and comforting the sun was on my way back there. It crossed my mind that if I had allowed fear to come along with me that day, any possibility of enjoying myself would not have happened. I was in my own little world that day as I felt a current of strength pulse through my veins. There was a sense of fierceness, of owning my feelings while I left fear in the dust. I knew that having control over my feelings was directing this whole experience as it unfolded in front of me. And I also knew that this vibrational high that I was on was gifted to me from a higher source because I couldn't explain where it was coming from. At a young age, I had adopted a strange habit of preparing for the worst over and over again in my mind. I learned to endure being uncomfortable in the worry. I was fooling myself by thinking if I worried hard enough, then somehow it would soften the blow when something bad actually did happen. Deep down, I believed that worrying meant I was aware, that I was on high alert, and therefore somehow was protecting myself. If I didn't worry, maybe that would mean I didn't care. Of course, that's not how it works. In fact, keeping myself on such a low emotional frequency of worrying meant that whenever any condition of my life was out of whack, I was dealing with it from a very weak and powerless state of mind. All those years of existing in fear created an environment for the cells of my body to weaken. And clearly, that weakness in my body turned into a large growth on my abdomen. When our mind is stuck in obsessive worry, our body's physiological response is the exact same as when we are actually facing danger. Even though in that moment we might be sitting at home completely safe. Our body's natural reaction to that worry is to activate the fight or flight response by increasing adrenaline and cortisol, which is the stress hormone. Being stuck in that chronic state of misperceived danger is what disrupts our body's homeostasis by keeping the sympathetic nervous system running on overdrive. This imbalance in our nervous system weakens the body's optimal functionality to maintain health. Hence the reality of why chronic stress is so hard on our bodies. This was such a critical point in my life. It was so much deeper than possibly having to deal with cancer. The tumor was just the surface issue, pointing to the proof that I had spent way too much time blocking myself from my inner guidance. This was a prominent fork in the road for me. It was an opportunity for me to get clear and to reset. If I went back to my old ways of thinking and comparing and perfectionism, I'd be creating an emotional environment for illness to just continue to fester. But if I followed my inner guidance, I'd be more focused on appreciating and enjoying my life. That would create a much healthier emotional environment for the cells of my body to thrive in. But that's easier said than done. I had gotten pretty good at feeling really crappy about myself over the years. Since I couldn't control the current situation of my body, my power and my strength came from taking full control of how I felt about what was happening in my body. Feeling appreciation for this whole situation was the path of least resistance. It seemed logical to move through it with total acceptance rather than push against it and be yanked around by fear. But I have to admit, the ease and excitement that I was feeling on a regular basis was not a conscious decision. I still can't explain the amazing, blissful feeling that had come over me the whole time. Before this growth showed up, I didn't realize that I could actually take control of how I'm feeling in any given moment. I didn't know I could do something to improve my emotional state every time I was feeling any type of discomfort. I used to believe that I was at the mercy of whichever feeling showed up. Whenever something unexpected did happen, I guess I subconsciously told myself, I can't help it, it's just the way I feel. I also believed that circumstances and events determined which feelings I was supposed to feel. Now I understand that we can choose which feelings we spend the most time with. It's always our own choice. We can intentionally let go of our emotional attachment to anything. It might take some time and focus to find a better feeling, but relief is always just waiting for an invitation to surface. I know now that radically accepting what is the first step to transform any challenging situation that makes us feel like we're falling apart. But this particular journey didn't actually make me feel like I was falling apart. It was actually the opposite. I felt like my whole life had been falling apart for years, and now this tumor was a chance to mend myself back together. Discovering the lump gave me permission to take a break from my old patterns. This was my chance to make a radical shift in my thinking, to find relief and to make new breakthroughs, and ultimately to restructure my limiting beliefs about myself. When you find yourself saying, I'll be happy when, or I'll be happy if, then you're giving away your own personal power until, or even if, that future event ever happens. We'll never be able to control every circumstance and every condition and every person in our life. And if our happiness depends on something or someone else changing first in order to meet our needs, we could end up waiting a whole lifetime to be happy. The time came for my surgery. It had been a couple months since I had first noticed the lump. No one knew whether or not I'd come out of my operation with all of my reproductive organs still intact. My fate would be decided once the tumor was diagnosed. Dr. Christianne Northrup, who is a leading authority in the field of women's health and wellness, had said that prior to her own personal surgery, she asked the attending anesthetist to read a particular phrase to her while she was being put under. And this inspired me to do the same. The idea of listening to something profoundly positive as I entered that medically induced altered state sounded very impactful to me. He graciously read my note back to me as I drifted off into that deep sleep. The note read, "I release and let go of whatever patterns and beliefs created this tumor." It turns out I did have a total hysterectomy. Apparently a second pathologist was called in to assess the tumor since they could tell it was malignant, but they couldn't come to a unanimous diagnosis of what type of cancer it was. I was told the tumor was malignant and was the size of a small loaf of bread. I thought it was the size of a lemon, but I guess it was malleable and just squished itself all around my inner organs. When the day came for me to be released from the hospital, my oncologist and her team came into my room to do my follow-up before I left. I was so excited to have this all behind me and looked forward to going back home into my daily life with a fresh new mindset. Unfortunately, that was not the case. The team of doctors came in with unexpected bad news. This was the plot twist I was not expecting, and the memory of this particular day has become a prominent turning point in my life. It turned out they still couldn't figure out the type of cancer I had. My oncologist was confident she had removed it all since there weren't any signs of it outside of the tumor. But since they couldn't identify the cancer, they believed there was a good chance I would need radiation and chemo. Their visit was brief, and they said it might take a couple of months before they knew the next step for me. And as soon as they left my room, I felt my heart fall out of my chest and shatter into 1,000 pieces. I was completely stunned. Throughout those past few months, I was on such a natural high, being led by that feeling that assured me I had nothing to fear. But now everything I believed in at my core was completely lost. I felt as though they delivered me a death sentence. A raging fear of death came over me, and images of me having to go back to that cancer hospital for treatments churned in the pit of my stomach. Everything I had been experiencing throughout this whole ordeal now felt like a big fat lie. The light inside of me completely went out. I can remember my tears flooding out, burning my cheeks, as I felt myself drowning in confusion and anguish and emptiness. I no longer had access to my soul. I felt like an empty shell. One of the nurses encouraged me to think about taking a shower before I left. And up until that day, I only had sponge baths, so I'd been craving a hot shower. But now it all just seemed so pointless. It was as though life had just played a huge joke on me, and it had me completely embrace my well-being throughout the last couple months, and then just shredded me to bits within minutes. This was one of the darkest moments of my life. I felt completely abandoned and lost. I eventually agreed to take a shower. My body felt 10 times its weight as I trudged over to the bathroom. I began to relax as I stood in the shower, and the sensation of the warm water started to loosen up the shackles of sadness that had restricted my breath. Then something started to happen. Without any warning, I began to feel a swirl of comfort starting in my head and wash over me with each droplet of water. As I watched the shampoo bubbles run down my body and slip away into the drain, I felt every ounce of fear being released from within me. Every cell in my body was swelling again with love and peace and reverence for my life. I was enveloped in a calm presence that assured me that all is well. It happened so suddenly and unexpectedly. All the fear that had taken over my body only moments before had completely vanished. In the meantime, my husband had called one of my sisters to tell her how crushed I had been from the doctor's visit, and she was standing in the room with him when I came out of the bathroom. I was surprisingly filled with a renewed passion for living, and they were both stunned as I announced, "It's back." I told them what happened in the shower, about the whole unexpected transformation and the return of that feeling. Everything felt new and different. I had a complete change of heart, and it had come over me so swiftly and so mysteriously. I went from feeling like my life was over to completely accepting whatever my future would bring. I no longer feared chemo or radiation or even facing death. It was a pure sense of surrendering to life and completely trusting that all really is well, no matter what was about to happen. I knew that with every fiber of my being, I could handle whatever was lined up for me. And I was just so thrilled to be plugged back into that comforting energy. I realized that it was not that my inner being had ditched me, it was that I had turned my attention to something very frightful and believed it. I had momentarily looked out through the eyes of fear rather than through the eyes of my inner being. Whatever it was that took place in the shower had instantaneously filled me with appreciation and inner joy again. It felt like a burst of love extending out to every corner of the planet, right from my very own heart. That moment in the shower felt incredibly special, and it brought me back to a space of pure potentiality. That experience in the hospital shower taught me a huge lesson. My personal power came from a change in how I was feeling, not from changing the situation. I went into the shower knowing that I might have to start cancer treatments and feeling severely depressed. And I came out of the shower still knowing I might have to start cancer treatments, but feeling on top of the world. So everything was different, but really all that had changed was my emotional state. The outside circumstances were still the same. It was only the emotional shift that was different. So our power lies in taking responsibility to make those internal shifts, to regulate our emotional well-being. After coming back home from the hospital, there were ups and downs as I got acquainted with a much different body than the one I had shown up to surgery with. But it was only a few days after getting home that my oncologist called with really great news. They confirmed what type of ovarian cancer it was. And since there was no sign of it outside of the tumor, there was no need for any further treatment. She said the main challenge would be dealing with the immediate onset of menopause because all my reproductive organs were removed. And estrogen replacement therapy was not an option since the cancer was endometrioid carcinoma, which is an estrogen-induced cancer. Along with the symptoms of menopause, like mood swings and hot flashes, came the second stage to learning even more about myself. While my body was adjusting to the depleted hormones, I adjusted to the changes that were happening as that natural high I was on began to wane over time. I noticed how directly related the hot flashes were to my stressful thoughts. It was the key reason for my internal body temperature to skyrocket every single time. The hot flashes had me desperately looking for ways to control that physical discomfort that came whenever I was thinking about something stressful. Over time, I came to realize that it wasn't about curbing the physical discomfort that my stressful thoughts would cause, but rather curbing the stressful thoughts that would cause the physical symptoms of the hot flashes. I realized that if I was able to take control of how my mind was operating by metabolizing my emotions, my body would then follow suit. Once again, the mind-body connection was calling for my attention, so I started to pay close attention to which of my thoughts would cause an internal blast of heat with a hot flash. We don't always have control over what's happening, but we can always take control over how we are feeling about what's happening. From that whole experience, I learned that no matter what causes us stress, it's most effective to take personal responsibility for our emotional state before trying to rectify the situation. Taking a deep dive into those internal stories to shift our thoughts and beliefs is how we begin to reshape our reality. The trick is to change ourselves first, and by that I mean change our thinking. Wayne Dyer always said, when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. And how we think about something is a direct measurement of how we feel in that moment. Throughout the years following my surgery is when I was introduced to some incredible healing modalities that help to process and clear the body and mind of any stressful thoughts and beliefs. I met fascinating people who teach these different techniques, and I've adopted these practices for my own personal development. Many of these techniques are life-changing because they offer a profound examination of the inner self. I've learned that it's important to regulate our nervous system in order to heal our emotional wounds. My favorite go-to for this type of healing is emotional freedom techniques, also known as tapping. I also love a process called The Work by Byron. I'm always open to learning new ways of reconditioning the mind. It can be really difficult to climb out of a dark feeling when we get stuck ruminating over the details of an upsetting issue. That just creates momentum for the problem to grow bigger in our minds and in our lives. So whenever something is causing you stress or grief, start thinking differently about whatever is causing you to suffer. In order to create a better situation, do whatever is necessary to move yourself up the emotional scale first, even if it means turning your attention away from the problem for a while. Find a way to feel good before dealing with a stressful issue. Our personal power lies within our emotional state. It's really difficult to navigate through life's challenges from a place of sadness or disempowerment. Not only has my body regained internal balance and wellness over time, but my mind continues to expand and be cleared of negativity as I explore my inner world. The desire to experience as much joy and peace as possible has totally become a priority for me. Even though it's easy to get thrown off course and lose my footing, my true self is always calling me to release and let go of anything that keeps me from experiencing authentic inner joy. Be your own mountain guide. By that I mean, if you were lost somewhere in the mountains, would you prefer to follow someone who is freaked out, angry, and frazzled? Or would you prefer to follow an exceptional mountain guide who remains calm, collected, and clear-minded? The only way to find your way out of a stressful situation is to get yourself to a calm, collected, and clear state of mind first. Like I said, be your own mountain guide. But what if it feels impossible to move out of a horrible feeling? Take it one step at a time. Be easy on yourself and continue to find what feels good. Maybe start with appreciation. There is always something to appreciate. Look around you. What is something that is right in front of you that is working in your favor, like fresh air or running water? or the technology that allows us to connect through things like this video. Maybe spend some time with your pet, or head outside and connect with nature, or even just take a few deep cleansing breaths. Then, when you look back again at whatever was bothering you, from this new vantage point of an improved feeling, notice if things seem a little bit more manageable now. What I learned most from my experience with cancer was that whether things are flowing effortlessly or if I'm being met with one of life's challenges, there is always an opportunity to choose how I feel about what is happening. It's a constant practice for me to stay focused on feeling good, but it's always worth the effort. Moving into a better feeling changes how we handle difficulties. As Albert Einstein said, you can't solve a problem with the same mind that created it. Changing our emotional state is how we change our mind. And taking responsibility for our emotional well-being always creates an opportunity to discover something about ourselves that we never knew before. Making a habit of bringing love to those hidden places of discomfort within us is how we can each contribute to impacting the world, to make our planet a better place. Improving our emotional energy improves how we relate to others. As more of us create harmony between one another throughout the world, the whole planet shifts and expands in love. And whenever you take a step up the emotional scale into love and joy, always find someone to share it with. Even if you're not able to share it with someone in person, as you hold them as your point of attention and send them love, you'll still reach them. The energy of love and joy will take on its own form, and it will ripple across the planet. Then it'll come right back to you. Love is the universal answer to all problems. Love is literally the answer to everything. And we all deserve to experience more love and more joy. It's our birthright. But always remember, happiness is an inside job. Inner joy finds us when we discover that no one other than ourselves is responsible for the way we feel.